I'm so honored to be able to speak with y'all today. Thank you for attending this summit that's focused on inclusive investment. So as noted, my name is Kasem. I'm the founding partner at Equilibrium Impact Ventures. I'm all the things that Matt said. I'm all the things you see here on the screen. I'm a few things you don't see on the screen, but really that's enough about me, because today and tomorrow are about you. And you are a miracle. Statisticians estimate that the odds of you or me being born are about 1 in 400 quadrillion. That's 4,000 trillion. In fact, the most unlikely thing to ever happen to you is probably your birth. And yet, here we all are today. Also consider, kind of embedded into this, the odds for humanity even surviving this long, given the natural food chain and our place in it. I mean, we're pretty slow. We're kind of weak, right? We rely on the land. We can't fly. All of these things don't really play into our favor. And in truth, humans only continue to exist because of our ability to collaborate, because of our collective intelligence, and because of our propensity to build community. And so through innovation and teamwork, we've overcome many of these innate weaknesses to make them strengths. We can not only fly now, but we can fly faster than the speed of sound. We can literally move mountains. We can even leave the planet. And yes, we can all sit together here in this space, even though we might be physically many miles apart. So we have chosen to be here today because we care about inclusion, because we acknowledge that the current state of inequity in our economic system is unacceptable. And we're here because we want to be agents of change, because we believe we can help to create a more equitable society. However, in order to do so, we must first confront and then tear down all of the myths that are holding us back. And myths are powerful things. They exist in our subconscious, they influence our behaviors and our beliefs. But we're going to be doing some myth busting today. And we'll start with the scarcity myth. And this is the idea that there is not enough stuff for everyone. And this myth has ignited greed within our hearts for millennia, and it still governs many of our economic actions to this day. Now, greed certainly has a biological basis tied to our hunting and gathering days. But over time, with the same ingenuity that allowed us to create the spaceship, we turned resource scarcity into a myth. And yet the delusion of greed still remains and drives many of our economic incentives. Consider the following assumptions: that there's not enough food. The world produces enough grain every year to provide every human with 3,500 calories a day. The US wastes 150 billion pounds of food every year. Still, 1 in 6 children in the US will go to bed hungry tonight. What about the idea that there are not enough homes? There are 500,000 individuals experiencing homelessness at any point in time in the US. At the same time, 17 million homes sit vacant. Also consider that in 2021, 1 in 5 residential home purchases was made by a hedge fund. So while we know there is enough to go around, we still behave as if we believe in the myth of scarcity. And perhaps this is because over the same time that we were overcoming scarcity, we also created social constructs around wealth. The greediest humans were rewarded with more and more wealth, which led to greater concentrations of power and influence. And eventually, these groups became the dominant culture. Then they set up systems to control access to currency of all types, both monetary and social. They also created new myths to entrench their control. And that is why it is so important to check our assumptions and to identify the unspoken mythology of our society and our culture. Now, one myth that we tend to subconsciously accept is the myth of meritocracy. The idea that the playing field is level and that everyone advances based on their ability and their merit. But we know this is false because in studying dominant cultures, we understand that the dominant group gets to make the rules. They write the laws, they set the customs, they establish the norms, and they do so to benefit themselves. And we'll dig into this more in a moment. But this includes setting the standards for merit and excellence, even the standards for beauty. And yeah, dominant culture, they get to write the history books. Members of non-dominant groups must conform to the dominant culture in order to gain access to resources. And even when they conform, access isn't always guaranteed. They must follow the law, learn the language, look the part, and behave within the norms. All of this reinforces, benefits, and strengthens the dominant culture. And this leads to inequity, not based on ability or merit, but based on intentional exclusion. Dominant culture can become so powerful that it can be taboo to even challenge the myths or to name them out loud. But we must brave this taboo. Because while uncomfortable, if inclusivity is truly our goal, it's imperative to understand why our systems, particularly our economic systems, have been so historically exclusive in the first place. Like a doctor examining a patient, we have to accurately diagnose the disease, the root cause, before we can begin treatment. And yes, we must do some unlearning. Which brings us to one of the most powerful myths in America, the myth of race. This myth says that we are different from one another based on the color of our skin. Now, to start, this has been thoroughly discredited through genetic testing, which has revealed that nearly everything we believe about race is wrong. Genetically speaking, we are nearly identical to one another across what we call racial lines. The color of our skin, the shapes of our noses and our eyes, all of that was determined through natural selection based on the climate of the land upon which we evolved. But perhaps more compelling than the science is where the concept of race and the idea of white as a race actually came from. Because it was not until the late 1600s, over 100 years after the first slave ships arrived in the colonies, that the idea of white and the idea of race came to be, and only because of political and economic expediency. So during this time, as the amount of work to be done in these growing colonies expanded, the availability of Irish and Scottish servants began to dwindle. This left plantation owners requiring more and more free labor to work the fields. And because plantation owners were so cruel, they also began to fear an uprising from both slaves and servants alike, especially after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, which saw Europeans and Africans band together against the colony of Virginia. The colonizers definitely understood the power of community. In the 1690s, as part of the reaction to Bacon's Rebellion, and as a way to preserve the power of the colony, Virginia passed a series of laws to enshrine the institution of chattel slavery, to stave off future rebellion, to scale the transatlantic slave trade, and to acquire more labor. This legislation created a new class of person called white, with special privileges and rights. For example, white people, even if they were enslaved, could one day work to become free. Those who were not white, however, could never become free, and were now considered hereditary slaves by law. One law, entitled An Act for Suppressing Outlying Slaves, contains the first known legal usage of the words white person, and it created law enforcement to chase down runaway slaves, a precursor to our modern day police. It also declared that any white person who married a non-white person would be banished from the colony. So in other words, what we think of as race is a purely political construct that was solely created to justify racially based slavery and to maintain a rift between communities of people based on skin color. It's called divide and conquer. This powerful myth of race, when established in a burgeoning nation, simultaneously institutionalized white supremacy into the fabric of every system in America through legal decree. By 1776, white supremacy had taken a strong foothold in the British colonies. About 20% of the population were African slaves when the United States was founded. This nation was created directly on top of over 600 existing indigenous nations. Manifest destiny drove the extending of this new nation's borders from sea to shining sea on the backs of slaves and servants. This went on for 3 centuries, and it established the infrastructure needed for this new dominant group called white people to concentrate immense amounts of power and wealth, while excluding almost everyone else from those same opportunities. In this nation, racialized chattel slavery was the law of the land until 1865. And immediately following emancipation, many states enacted Jim Crow laws, re-enshrining a continuation of white supremacy for another 100 years. This discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin was legal until 1964. Every incremental step toward progress has taken decades and centuries to achieve. Anyone with a shred of intellectual honesty would acknowledge that this level of long-term systemic oppression of a people would create generations of economic and social disparity. And while this is Black History Month, this is not Black history. This is American history. It is European history, and it is the history of colonization. But it's also our current reality. Since the election of Barack Obama, 25 states have passed laws making it harder for Black, brown, and poor people to vote. We all remember what we saw on January 6th. We can see them burning books, and we are watching legislators pass laws to prevent American children from learning the history that I just presented. We are still fighting the shadows of colonialism. They will not go gently into the night. But in case this may all seem overwhelming, there is another great myth at play here. And that is the myth that we are powerless to enact change, when we as a species have literally been to the moon and back. We can accomplish whatever we put the power of community behind. The tools of our trade are innovation and revolution. The situation we find ourselves in today truly calls for both. And more on this later. But first, let's look our current problem in the face. Because this is the economic reality that the myth of race has created. I believe we are all at this summit today because we understand that the fastest way to close these economic gaps and alter our trajectory is to fundamentally change how we think about investing. The world of investment, in particular private equity and venture capital, has created enormous amounts of wealth while remaining especially exclusive by design, out in the open, and as a brand. And here's how much venture funding has gone to Black and Hispanic founders over the last several years in the US. Do you notice anything? While the sheer amount of money going into venture funding has skyrocketed, Black and brown founders have remained stuck at about 2% or less of the total funding pie. This is the problem we need to solve as a community. And we need to dig under this problem to uncover the myths that have been holding us back, because these numbers have not budged. So let's bust some myths. Let's first ask, why does so little funding go to Black and brown founders? Well, one possible assumption is that there just aren't any qualified Black and brown founders to invest in. However, a review of pipeline data done by the Kauffman Foundation shows that since 1980, Black and Hispanic people have been graduating with advanced degrees at an accelerating rate, while the rate of college-educated whites has actually dropped. However, this is not directly translated to either jobs in tech or in startup leadership. The entrepreneurship rates of Hispanic people have outpaced everyone else by leaps and bounds, yet they continue to get less than 2% of all investments. So why is it so incredibly difficult for Black and brown founders to secure investment? And why isn't the increase in pipeline converting to increased entrepreneurship or funding opportunities? Where's the disconnect here? Well, one insightful way to examine this question is to ask, well, how do investors source their deals? And in what may seem ironic in a moment, Harvard conducted an in-depth analysis of 900 venture capital investors to ask them, how do you source your deals? And here are the results. 30% of deals come from former colleagues. 20% of them come from other investors, other VCs. About 10% are referrals from their existing portfolio companies, the companies that they invest in. And then 30% are outbound searches. So the investors go out and find businesses to invest in, and they usually go to the same places: accelerators, pitch competitions. And investors can only go to the communities that they know and understand. And sometimes they can only work regionally. But only 10% of deals happen because of a cold email or something coming inbound. This means that 90% of deals actually come from inside existing investor networks and as far as they can reach out their arms and touch. Even if you get a chance to pitch a VC, only 1 out of every 101 companies that a VC reviews will actually end up with an investment. So these are pretty long odds. And it looks like being in network is pretty important. So the next logical question would be, well, what do those networks look like? And by the numbers, 95% of VCs are either white or Asian, and 78% are male. So if a VC is sourcing a deal from another VC or a former colleague, there's an overwhelming likelihood that both VCs in the conversation are males, and a very good chance that they are both white males. If you look at money under management, the disparity becomes absolutely one-sided. White males control 93% of all of the money currently sitting in VC funds. Well, okay, so what about the other sources of deals? What about, let's say, people they went to school with? And if a VC is sourcing a deal from a former classmate, there's an overwhelming likelihood that both VCs went to Stanford or Harvard or another Ivy League school. Working VCs who go back to school overwhelmingly go to the same schools that feed the pipeline. This is critically important because these pipelines are also designed to be exclusive. And they are obviously creating a highly inequitable funding landscape based on the data. So let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's just take a look at Harvard, which is often cited as the birthplace of venture capital. And there are many myths to be unpacked here, because this is why Harvard is considered exclusive. And these points are indicative of many of the schools on the VC pipeline. Firstly, Harvard operated as a prestigious institution of higher learning for 233 years before having a Black graduate, and 284 years before admitting its first woman student. Secondly, this year's incoming class had an admissions rate of 3.9%, the lowest in the school's history, and tied with Stanford for the lowest in the country. And third, the cost of attendance. Look at those numbers. These costs ensure that a bulk of the student body is coming from wealth. And here's where we start to uncover some myths. Because to many, perhaps to most, Harvard is believed to be exclusive because they only accept the best. With a 3.9% admission rate, they only accept the best, right? And with that price tag, only the best, right? Remember the myth of meritocracy? Now, because Harvard is a private university, they do not have to disclose their admissions process. However, over the past few years, Harvard has been embroiled in legal battles about how race plays a role in how they decide which students to accept and which to deny. In fact, this case will be heard by the Supreme Court in October of this year, along with a similar case against the University of North Carolina. Now, we're not going to argue the merits of this case today, but I do want to present some information that was released into the public record by the court as part of the legal process of discovery. And this information speaks to the myth of meritocracy. And it allows us to take a very rare peek into an internal process called legacy admissions. Now, legacy admissions exist at many exclusive universities, most of the Ivy League, so this is not particular to Harvard. But what is so compelling here is that without the recent lawsuits, we would not have access to this information at all. So what are legacy admissions anyway? Well, it's basically a way for some students to cut in line and get preferential treatment during the admissions process. At Harvard, these students fall into 4 categories. The first are recruited athletes, and these make up less than 1% of total applications, but legacy athletes make up 10% of the student body. And at Harvard, these athletes are majority white, and they have an admission rate of nearly 100%. The second group are the dean's interest list. These are students whose families have donated to the school above a certain amount. Those who tend to give and give often can land their kids on this list. These students have a 42% admissions rate. Remember that the most recent general admission rate was 3.9%. So this means if your family donated to Harvard early and often, that you would be 7 to 8 times more likely to be admitted. The third group are students whose parents are faculty members. These students have a 47% admissions rate. And the last group are students whose parents are alumni. And these students have a 34% admissions rate. Now, demographically, 71% of all of these legacy applicants are white. And with the higher acceptance rates for legacy application, it actually turns out that 43% of all white students at Harvard are, in fact, legacy students. And perhaps that's not surprising, but here's the kicker. Based on Harvard's own application scores, 75% of white students admitted through legacy admissions did not meet admission standards. Okay, so let's visualize this because this helps me put things into perspective. If the 100 icons on the left represent 100% of white students at Harvard, then 43 of them, those 43 in the middle, would be legacy students. Of those 43, about 32 of them, 75% of 43, do not meet admissions criteria. This means that 32%, or 1 in 3, of all white students at Harvard got into the school without meeting the criteria that was required of others. Every argument against affirmative action cites a scenario such as this: a large percentage of below standard people taking the place of those who deserve it more. If we apply this percentage to the incoming class using the demographics supplied by Harvard on their website, that would equate to 415 students. Think about the 3.9% admissions rate for everyone else. Who might have gotten excluded in this scenario? Now, let me be clear, because almost every major private university has legacy admissions. And in 2019, a scandal rocked the news and implicated Stanford, Yale, Georgetown, and several other elite universities, along with some Hollywood actors. This has been going on for a long time, in secret, and it will continue to go on until universities put a stop to it. So let's bust this myth right now. Graduates from these exclusive universities are no smarter, are no more effective, are no better qualified than graduates with similar degrees from schools like Michigan State or Ohio State or Florida A&M or Queen's University. Yet these pipelines of opportunity, the exclusive ones, the ones many call elite, and the ones that run directly into venture capital are working to keep one group of individuals in the system while keeping other groups out. And as a result, the outputs from these pipelines are still overwhelmingly white and male. It is the myth of race balanced upon the myth of meritocracy. Exclusive is the VC brand. It has always been a feature and not a bug, a source of pride and not shame. And that is what makes inclusive investment such a groundbreaking concept. But executing it doesn't require groundbreaking ideas necessarily. Remember, you are not powerless. That is a myth. In fact, with this knowledge, there are some simple policy and procedure changes that can make outsized differences. If you're a person of influence in investment, private equity, venture capital, if you're an employer in these spaces, if you are in higher education, you can work to bust these myths. For example, your firm can begin to do blind interviews. This will eliminate the bias towards certain schools and certain employers. Funds can begin to eliminate warm intros. There's a growing movement for this. Perhaps every submission to your fund can go through a front door application process, and every application for funding can get some consideration by the fund. Yeah, this is slow, but it's so much more fair. And then lastly, of course, universities can just eliminate legacy admissions. Studies have shown that this would increase equity in universities across the country. Or maybe you do have a groundbreaking idea, because we need those too. In fact, we have every right to challenge the existing ideas of what investment can and should look like as we tear down these myths and build new ideas in their ashes. For example, at my firm, Equilibrium Impact Ventures, We have intentionally built our thesis around creating equity in our investments. We've done this through creating a diverse general partner team. We do it by allotting at least 2/3 of our funding to Black, Brown, and women founders. We do it by supporting and investing into new networks and pipelines. And we do it by directly funding companies that are solving for these equity gaps. And these are not just the right things to do, we also know that it's good business. So we all understand the power of community, and we've seen how critical it is to have access to VC networks. So our goal should be to expand these networks to be more inclusive of everyone. This summit is a great example of an opportunity to start building those connections. Investors must work to find new partners, including nonprofits doing the work of equity and universities outside of the Ivy League, especially HBCUs. However, we cannot gloss over the centuries of myth reaffirmation and systemic oppression. Indeed, this network expansion will take trust. And trust is a loaded word. So I will leave you with some wisdom from Brené Brown based on her extensive research into trust. So first, let's define trust. And we can define it as choosing to make something that's important to you vulnerable to the actions of someone else. Inclusion and equity is important to all of us. And in order to work with each other to build a better world, we will have to put ourselves in places of vulnerability. Now, because the word trust is so loaded, it helps to break it down into 7 components. And I believe these principles can be impactful for us to take into the summit and beyond as we seek to build trust and vulnerability with one another. And these components use the acronym BRAVING, because when we are vulnerable, we are also being brave. So let's make these commitments to one another as we start to build connection. The first one is boundaries. We must set boundaries. We must hold them, and we must respect them. If you're an investor or an organization looking to join this movement, seek out those who are already doing the work. Understand their boundaries and don't cross them. If you're an organization doing this work, set your boundaries and communicate them clearly. Secondly, trust requires reliability. This means that you do what you say you will do over and over and over again, because we can't trust one another if we do not follow through on our commitments. If you say you're going to write a check, then you better write a check. Third, accountability. This means that we own our mistakes, we apologize, and we work to make amends. Nobody is perfect. So giving one another and ourselves grace to mess up and then make it right is critical. V is for vault. And this means that whatever we share with one another in these spaces, we will hold in confidence. It means we will continuously demonstrate a commitment to confidentiality. It means we won't share stories that aren't ours to share. And it means we won't gossip. I is for integrity, which is so important in this work. Integrity means choosing courage over comfort, choosing what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy. It means practicing our values, not just professing them. And especially if you're in a place of privilege, you must be courageous to break down the myths and to speak truth to power in your spheres of influence. This is called being an ally. N is for non-judgment. And this means that I can ask for what I need and you can ask for what you need without either of us judging one another. It means we can talk about how we feel without judgment. It means we will ask for help, and it means that we will help one another. Asking for help is a sign of strength and not weakness. And then finally, generosity. And this is not just generosity with your money and your time. It also includes extending the most generous interpretation to the intentions, the words, and the actions of others. We cannot build trust if we are constantly assuming the worst of one another. If we do all of these things, all of them together, we will expand the inclusiveness of our networks on a strong foundation of trust. As a result, we will spark both innovation through new ideas and revolution through defeating these myths. And my friends, innovation and revolution are truly the only two things that have ever rapidly changed the human experience for the better. Please enjoy the rest of the summit. Reach out to me on LinkedIn or any other social platforms to continue the conversation. May you all be well, happy, and peaceful. Thank you.